So good afternoon, everybody. It's 2 p.m. In the UK, and we have an unusual CG webinar today, which is a real delight for me. I'm David Mills. I'm director and facilitating this conversation today with Ramon Torrent, who is someone who has done some very interesting things, and he's going to be talking particularly about OBREAL, which is an organization that he's helped set up, born in 2004, that began as an observatory of EU Latin American relations and has become a really important broker network, facilitator of South-South collaboration and policy community making. This is something which he is very proud of, and I think has achieved a great deal. And I think, Ramon, you're going to help us talk or understand what it is about your experience, but also about the Spanish university situation that enabled you to be in the right place in the right time to set up a network that brought together Latin America and Europe, partly through the good offices of Spanish universities, of which you are part of University of Barcelona. So please do talk about that, and then you can perhaps talk us through the challenges of collaboration and the good aspects of it, and the difficulties, and what we actually mean by partnership, because there's an awful lot of discussion right now in the higher education community around what equal partnerships might look like, what global partnerships might look like. So this is less of a research webinar than normal, but I think we're going to be drawing a lot on your knowledge and expertise. So Ramon, please introduce yourself and tell us a bit about you and your experience, and then we'll have a conversation, and then we can open it up to the floor as well.
Okay, thanks very much, David. I will speak for around 15 minutes. Great. To leave plenty of time for discussion later, if what I'm saying arouses your interest.
Of course it will.
First, I must apologize for my bad English. You'll see later on today and in the other webinars of this series that this is important. I have always said that it is not right that the main, often the only language of international relations, also in the higher education sector, is English. In particular, and first of all, because the lingua franca, as people say, is not English, but English, which is what most people in this field use, beginning by myself. So apologies for my bad English. Second, I will introduce myself very briefly, saying that I'm very old, as all of you can see. I'm a retired professor of political economy and international economic law at the University of Barcelona. But I have had many lives in my life, more than a cat, beginning with being involved in higher education policy as a student, as one of the leaders of the democratic student movement against the Franco's regime. I always say that the thing I'm more proud in my life is of having been expelled from the Spanish university before I was 19. That means quite young. Then I was able to finalize the studies after a 2-year periods of expulsion and the military service and so on. I got a scholarship and one trip passport to come to England, to the University of Reading, where I studied methodology of social sciences. Then I went back to Barcelona. I was again involved in higher education policy during the democratic transition in Spain. I spent intensively 10 years of my life trying to reform the University of Barcelona as a vice rector in the first democratically elected rectorate and also of the Spanish university with not much success. Then I had the opportunity to be selected in a procedure to work in the European Union. I landed not in the European Commission, this is important, but in the Council of the European Union and in the legal service. And there I become the director for international economic relations. And then after 10 years, we decided with my wife, great mistake, if you allow me, to return to Barcelona, where I launched two lines of work, one on international economic law and policy, and the other on international cooperation in higher education. The second led to the setting up of OBREAL, as you said, an association of universities dealing with all areas of EU Latin American relations. This developed, this enlarged its scope, in particular geographically, and now OBREAL in 2017 became OBREAL Global and was supported by associations of universities, and now our main partners are associations of universities, in particular the Association of African Universities, and also the main associations of universities in the different countries of Latin America. And now to the topic. This webinar has a title very paradoxical, David, because you are the director of a Center for Global Higher Education. I'm the president of an association whose official name is OBREAL Global, and we find ourselves somehow criticizing the use of global or the global perspective for international cooperation in higher education. I think that to make my introduction, this is the main point. It makes sense that your center is global and that our observatory is global, because this is a nickname to see that we are looking at the world. But the use of global in this context is not dangerous because we are one. You are one center in Oxford. I'm one association with headquarters in Barcelona and with international participation. So we are one. But when you begin to use global, not to designate one, but to designate a system of international relations, the situation changes, because we discover that the globe is not, in fact, a subject of policy and one member of a system of international relations, but is rather the object. The globe is the object of international relations. So what happens? It happens that when we turn to international relations in higher education, we very easily discover that the two main actors in international higher education relations are, on one side, the regulators, the governments, and on the other side, the regulated, the universities. Because even if they are regulated, they have much more autonomy than any other regulated institution in any other social sector. So international cooperation in higher education should be a matter for governments and for individual universities. However, here is when the problems appear. Why? Because education, including higher education, is a very sensitive sector for reasons that we all know. So, in fact, governments are very reluctant to cooperate and to surrender its absolute margin of maneuver and of policy design and implementation. Let's not forget that the whole point about launching the Bologna process is to have it launched without any legal commitment and without a line of EU law or of international law behind it. And if we look at UNESCO, I defend the logic of the multilateral system in all sectors, but we discovered that the capacity of policy making, of policy reform, or policy transformation by UNESCO is very limited. So we end up this first approach with a pessimistic conclusion. Okay, we love international cooperation, also in higher education, but the regulators do not want to cooperate. Then we turn to universities. And the problem with universities is that they are too many, too different, too sparse, too inward looking on their own problems, that you cannot put them under one umbrella of international relations. In particular, if using the word in the jargon that you don't like, David, and I don't like either, we want this to be inclusive. That is to say, at least open to all universities. And so it is clear that at the global level, however we define it, a small university in Guatemala or in the Democratic Republic of Congo or in Bangladesh will not be able to find its place, its voice, its way of participating in a global umbrella. So, second pessimistic conclusion, we were willing to organize international relations in higher education, and we discovered first that the regulators are not for the job, and now we discover that universities maybe are for the job, but you cannot inclusively imply all. However, we then discover that there is an intermediate level that exists. Above governments, there are regional integration organizations. I'm very critical of them, beginning by the European Union. However, they exist. They have a legitimacy. They have been the result of agreements ratified by Parliament, or parliaments have decided to get out from them, as your House of Commons. However, the regional organizations are there. So we have actors. And these actors have an advantage, is that they are much more equal than states individually considered. You can judge or appreciate as you want the European Union and the African Union. But it is clear that there is much more equality between the European Union and the African Union than between any small country in Africa or Germany or the United Kingdom. So there we have an actor for a collection of actors for the side of the regulators, international organizations ratified by parliaments and managed by government. And then at the other end, at the end of the regulated of individual universities, you have also regional associations. You have the European University Association. You have the Association of African Universities. Don't ask me to criticize these universities because I'm too critical, and now I must be polite and must refrain from criticizing. But they are there. They are open. They are inclusive. Any university can enter the European University Association, and any African university can enter the Association of African Universities. The same happens with the national associations of universities in Latin America. The same happens in ASEAN. The same happens in other parts of the world. So we have here a hard one. a hardware with the regional organizations of states and the regional organizations of universities. Of course, you will tell me, David, and all our friends in the webinar, but this is a hardware that is very, very, very weak. And I say, of course, but it exists. So we all remember, in particular, the ones who are old, that at the beginning, computers were also very weak, only were able to process a few bytes, but they existed. And people were clever enough to first design the software, not very heavy, that was able to be processed by this hardware. And then, as the hardware got more powerful, it was able to process software that also was more heavy. Let's use this comparison for international dialogue and cooperation in higher education. If we are clever enough to design a software soft, not very heavy, that can be processed by a hardware not so powerful, we have solved our problem. We have solved our problem with an approach that I baptized, I christened a few years ago as ambitiously modest. Modest because the means are modest, because the hardware is humble, because the software is not very heavy, but ambitious because we move forward in what was the idea at the beginning of my presentation. Organize a meaningful way of talking, of collaborating, of discussing, of thinking on international relations in higher education. And to be absolutely honest with you, as I'm an old-fashioned Democrat leftist of the 60s, I consider that this objective, ambitious, is worthwhile. As the world goes much better to have people in the area of international relations cooperating and talking about modest initiatives than throwing bombs, the one or the other, or thinking only on the power of money to organize these relations. I think I've kept to my 15 minutes, David. So I'm in your hands and in the hands of all friends participating in the webinar.
Good. Thank you very much, Ramon, for keeping to 15 minutes. Welcome to those of you who have recently joined. We are doing an unusual conversation today. Less of a piece of research being presented, but more some reflections from someone who has been very involved in thinking about international relations. And Ramon, you've given us a very, very helpful sort of short biography of the organization and its creation as a form of ambitiously modest hardware, as you put it, for facilitating conversations. And one of the things we have been talking about quite a lot in Centre for Global Higher Education has been these questions of geopolitics. So what you've offered us then is the value of organizations, the value not just of regional organizations, but in the case of OBREAL, an interregional organization. You haven't said that much about how this interregional organization might be different from other ones. I think obviously one level is not a European region, it's an interregional. It started as you said, European, Latin American, and now it is very much a interregional global, even if that is a contradiction because of your work with African universities. You allow universities to become members, okay? and
Yeah.
they can participate in the governance of this interregional organization. So at one level, what we're doing here then is thinking about the role of university organizations. And I guess my first question for you is, I mean, perhaps one thing that is important and different about OBREAL Global is that it's not any region, okay? It is and starts with the EU. And it's not simply an organization in that you also have become a conduit for EU funding. That's fair to say, isn't it? And you have had several very big EU grants for collaboration building and region building. So I think the first thing perhaps would be for you to talk a little bit about those grants. There have been a series of them, and for me to be a bit more provocative, do you think the reason that your interregional organization has been influential is because the EU itself, through the Bologna process, has been very influential in shaping debates around the form and content and structure of higher education? And we can see that very much in the way in which Bologna has traveled far beyond Europe's shores, into North Africa and to Latin America as well. So yeah, so perhaps you could reflect on that, the relationship with the EU, and if that's part of what makes OBREAL special.
And don't forget, David and colleagues, that I worked in Brussels in the area of international relations for 10 years, in the hardcore of first the European communities and then the European Union in international relations. That is the Council. I have emphasized this, not the Commission, but the Council. So we have to have a perspective in which the intersection between the European Union and its member states must be always well kept and well understood. And at the time, it was many years ago, because then we made the mistake with my wife of returning to Barcelona. But at that time, the master word in international economic relations and in international trade relations in Brussels was the primacy of the multilateral system headed by the World Trade Organization. And I'm so naive that I became very interested in this, and I became a believer in it. The multilateral system was invented in 45, 47. Nice to remember this in another webinar, David, in order to get rid of the trade wars leading to full-blown wars before the Second World War. Something to be remembered today when people seem to be very happy to talk about trade wars with China and with the other and with the other. So the multilateral system was an instrument of pacification. Why? Because it is based on one principle, and the principle is not many, the principle of non-discrimination between states. And this is a principle, the principle of the most favored nation, that was at the origin of the United Nations, of the World Bank institutions, and of GATT. As I have always been a believer in the multilateral system, and I would be very happy with the multilateral system covering the area of higher education in a very effective and impactful way. The problem is that it seems that it's not able. So I do not want to move from multilateral to bilateral, because people forget that when we move from many to a few, by definition, there are exclusions. When I was explaining international economic law and policy with my other hat and my return from Brussels, I always talk to Latin Americans, for example, and I ask them, are you in favor of an agreement between the European community and Colombia? And they said, yes, 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 of course. And I say, listen, why are you so nasty against Brazil or against Peru? Because are you aware that an agreement between the European Union and Colombia is a non-agreement with Peru, and an agreement that favors investments going to Colombia and not to Peru? Why do you want to make harm to Peru? And students, even very good master and PhD students, were very surprised by the argument. This applies also to our area. I accept the fact that the European Union has bilateral or bi-regional relations with countries and with regions of the world. And we honestly earn our living as association with the management of these projects. I say we earn our life because we are a very strange association in which members do not pay any quota, any fee, nor for entry or annual. So we have to keep our lives managing projects as if we were a consultancy. But we are not a consultancy firm. We are an association of universities and associations of universities with a policy. And this policy is interregional. And if you ask me what kind of interregional, I would say south, south, north. What is the meaning of this? First, it begins with south-south. Words have a meaning, and if they come first, is maybe because we would like south-south to take the lead of the dialogue. And then we are north. But when I write north, I write north with an S in parentheses. Why? Because there is not one north. There are different norths. This is why I don't like the expression the global south. The global south does not exist. Latin America and Africa and Bangladesh and Pakistan are very different. They are not one south. They are different souths. So the dialogue must be south-south. But the same happens in the north. There is not one north. There are different norths. The position of the European Union and the stand and the policy of the European Union is not the same as that of the United States. And that of the United States is not the same of Canada. And the North would cover in higher education a country that is in the South, that is to say, Australia. And to complicate more the matter, there are countries in the global South that maybe are entering the North. And there are two big ones with more than 1,300 million people, each one of them, that we don't know if in a few years they will be in the North or in the South. North and South are, at the end, geographical terms that we should use carefully. We should use it carefully because I'm sure that most of you are not aware that Beijing is at the north of Washington, even at the north of New York. And that Australia, a country in the north from a political perspective in higher education, to my knowledge, is not in the north, but rather in the south. And maybe you have not metabolized that India is in the north. Geography, I always say, and allow me the joke, is very amusing. When after leaving Brussels, I went to the United States, I discovered there that the vision of the world is completely different from the one in Europe. I was told in school when I was a kid that the globe had two hemispheres, north and south. And then I discovered in Washington, in the School of Advanced International Studies of the Johns Hopkins University, that it was there the first time I heard this, that the world has two hemispheres, Western and Eastern. And with my stupid Eurocentric way of looking at it, I thought that the West covered Western Europe and the United States. And then I discovered that this was not the case. Europe was in the Eastern Hemisphere, and the Western Hemisphere was only North and South America. So this is something, and are nearly jokes that are worth to explain, because if not, we are too much led by the usual use of the words. But in any case, this is why, even if we are in our life managing projects funded by the European Union, not exclusively, but I would say at more than 90%, we still keep interregional south-south-north perspective.
Good, thank you. Sorry, I was cut off briefly there, but I think that was a really interesting defense of why we need almost to abandon these labels of north, south, east, west, and to recognize the dangers of them, whilst at the same time attending to the power relations that go on. If anyone would like to ask a question, please do feel free to raise your hand or put a note in the chat. I will keep an eye on the chat. I'm actually doing this on my phone today, so it might be a bit harder than normal for me to do this. But Ramon, perhaps your next question from me is, a big issue, I guess, is as you put it, how you keep the hardware going, okay? And one challenge is how one keeps associations going. And what do you think it is about the way OBREAL works that people still want to keep coming and be part of it? What's the secret of the ways in which you organize your dialogues?
Listen, I didn't know you would raise this question. No, I always answer the questions to the best of my ability. And I would answer it a bit provocatively, not knowing if this is the right answer from the perspective of the members of the association. So I'm giving my answer.
Of course.
And my answer is by using, again, a word in the jargon, by being transparent. You have been able to notice in the past 35 minutes that in good French, my French is a bit better, less bad than my English, je ne mâche pas le mot. So I do...
Very good, it's absolutely fine.
Or je ne parle la langue de bois. C'est-à-dire, I try to speak clearly. And I say, and in all our activities, we say what we think. So if people are interested in the perspective of interregional, maintaining the primacy of the multilateral system, but noticing that the multilateral system doesn't go too much further in cooperation, and organizing interregional dialogue, I say so. I will add another element of answer to your question that maybe explains the relative success of OBREAL. And it is that we also take very seriously that the dialogue and cooperation in higher education must be ambitiously modest. And if you allow me, I'll use two examples or three examples that all of you know much better than I do, because you are much more experts in higher education than I am. I'm an interdisciplinary guy that tries to think, and libre penseur of the 18th century, maybe. You cannot tackle everything at the level of international relations in higher education. Why? Because there are issues that are too sensitive, too complicated to handle by the hardware that I have described before. For example, you cannot discuss meaningfully at the interregional level an issue like public and private universities. The dialogue will turn either void or content, or will become very contentious. You cannot discuss meaningfully at the level of interregional dialogue the main issues of funding of universities, including the weight of tuition fees paid by the students and the level of grant by government. But you can meaningfully discuss issues of reform in teaching practices. You can discuss whether a student-centered perspective must become true or not, and whether we can accept that the old textbooks are replaced, even replaced for the worst, for modern PowerPoints, presentations by lecturers, and why we should not turn to problem solving, to living labs, to law clinics as a main perspective for teaching. You can teach this, because the problems with raising this issue, David, are not politico-geographical, are problem with our beloved corporation of lecturers and the conservative bias that we all have as lecturers. But this is perfectly able to be discussed internationally, because the same problem appears everywhere. So another issue that is...
Sorry, I want to just jump in here. I mean, we have got a couple of questions in the chat, and I wonder whether we should actually go to the audience and get their reflections, because one of the ones that have been asked is about accreditation, which we'll come to. I think it's quite important. But perhaps, Rachel, would you like to ask your question first about OBREAL and its relationship with other Spanish actors?
Yeah, thanks, David. Thanks, Ramon. I was just wondering if you could say something a little bit about how OBREAL is kind of seen within the Spanish context, what kind of higher education actors within Spain think about it, so kind of leaders of universities, university staff, unions. Is it seen as a body that kind of, has power, and what's its influence on Spanish higher education?
Brilliant. Thank you, Rachel.
I'll give the answer very candidly in two steps. First step, OBREAL was created by the University of Barcelona. It was an invention of the University of Barcelona. You can say, Rachel, by the University of Barcelona, when you, Ramon, were there, and you were very good friend of the successive rectors. This is true. But the fact is that it was created by the University of Barcelona. So, and other Spanish universities are members of OBREAL. However, I will confess that OBREAL's perspective is not that of most universities in Spain, or I would say in Europe, for one reason that can be of interest to raise now briefly. A rector of the University of Barcelona, a very good friend, once said in public, so this is why I can repeat his words. It took me 2 years to understand what Ramon was trying to explain to me. And why? Because rectors in Spain and rectors in most universities in Europe are not aware that, in particular, if they are public universities endowed with autonomy, they have the possibility and the obligation of having a policy of international relations. Universities and rectors and vice-chancellors tend to see the institutions they are sharing as conglomerates of faculties in the school, of departments, and at the bottom end of lectures. And the only policy that is clear to the rector of the vice-chancellor is to promote and to help these units to collaborate internationally. But if you ask them, listen, what is the policy of the university? More clearly, what is your policy as a rector, as a vice-chancellor? He or she will be very uncomfortable, because he will not like to answer. I could be more incisive in the question. I would say, listen, are you more interested in working with universities in Africa or with universities in the United States? The degree of uncomfort would increase exponentially.
Of course.
But this is a legitimate question, not a legitimate question. It's a question that requires an answer.
Yeah.
If I was a rector and I was asked this question, I would perfectly well note what I would answer. I would say, of course, we are one of the best universities in the country, and it is very important for us to keep a good relationship in teaching and in particular in research, looking for excellence with universities in the United States and Canada. I would say yes, but I'm someone who believes that the world must change. And in order for the world must change, we must remember that we were the ones who colonized and produced a few genocides in Africa, and now we have to take seriously the relationship with Africa.
Yeah.
You know, many rectors of vice-chancellors who would be able to give this answer or the opposite one. I believe in democracy, so people can know. So the approach of universities having an institutional policy of international relations as universities, as one, as units, is not something that rectors and vice-chancellors believe. So when it's very difficult to push this. And this is why probably the best way of not convincing, but at least showing people what they can do through us is being transparent. And people in the Spanish university know that if they want to have good or improve their relationships with African universities, OBREAL is very useful. And if they want to strengthen links with Harvard and Stanford, it is not so useful. That's it.
Yes. I think that's a very good answer, Ramon, because I think it also highlights the challenge that universities leaders face in terms of taking strong positions on behalf of their universities, because of course universities are very loosely coupled. They are, you know, the vice chancellors don't feel empowered to speak for the university. Perhaps that's one of the challenges, and perhaps that's why the organizationals that they join implicitly communicate some of those values. But I think that's very interesting what you're saying about, and I also wonder whether this is beginning to change as universities recognize that then they can take and build, you know, that they are involved in science diplomacy. That's certainly one of the things we've been thinking about in terms of geopolitics in our center's work. But I wonder whether that's a slow change, but also, as you say, Ramon, very much a lot of the geopolitics still remains about being world leading and internationally competitive and all, etc., etc. It's not necessarily about how we build radically different models of partnership. But can I come to that second question around other models of collaboration? Because we haven't talked about the UNESCO conventions, and I know we are having another webinar where we will return to that. But can I ask James Kelly, who actually has asked a very interesting question in the chat about the role of transnational conventions. James, the screen's yours.
Thanks very much. I'm joined by a few colleagues who are off camera. We work in medical education, and there one of the primary drivers in international collaboration is very much around meeting transnational accreditation requirements from bodies such as the World Federation for Medical Education. And that's probably a driver which is discouraging regional collaboration and encouraging global north, global south, for want of a better term, collaboration. So I wondered what your thoughts were around how regional collaborations can engage with transnational accreditation systems.
Thank you.
This I would be able to discuss with more time in front of us. But and maybe in the next two webinars, we can come back to this. But again, if I receive a question, I feel obliged to give an answer. What I learned in Brussels, not in the books, but working in international relations, was something that will shock a lot of you, in particular coming from an old-fashioned leftist Democrat, as I said, and is the following. You cannot translate at the international level the priorities and the topics you deal with at the national level, because the logics are different, and I will use it as an example. I think that few people have more pedigree than I have in fighting for democracy and human rights in Spain, that is to say at the national level. But if you ask me whether human rights must be priority number one at the international level, I would say no. No, because at the international level, the priority for me, you can disagree, is peace in the more elementary sense of absence of war and absence of death. I have always said this. Maybe now people will understand that it is not stupid this as an idea, but this is an idea. So this applies to ours. We could discuss, James, and probably we would disagree, but this is how we discuss, on the importance of quality assurance and accreditation at the national level. However, what I know is that the more sophisticated and powerful integration mechanism in the world, which is the European Union, has not been able to legally harmonize this. And this remains as a mechanism of collaboration between national agencies with some strange, allow me to say this, some strange bodies that exist at the global level, here I would use it, in medicine or in accounting, that produce some sort of accreditation. So the first answer to my question, to your question, would be, let's be clear about examining the facts. From this, I would add a second part of the answer. And the answer would be, one of the issues we emphasize more is that cooperation between universities, as when I went from Barcelona to the University of Reading 54 years ago, is not made on the basis of harmonization, because on the basis of willingness to collaborate. And transnational accreditation can empower universities. If a university is transnationally accredited and another university is also transnational accredited, it will be much easier for them to collaborate than not. But the driving force, I think, James, you would agree with me, the driving force is more bottom-up than top-down, from regulator to regulator. One of the policy briefs we have produced, and then Olusula Oyebole will be able to present next week, is one on empowering universities as development agents. Universities must be empowered. And in order to empower them, anything works. If you want to find the best justification from the OBREAL perspective to your honest way of earning your life, would be this helps to empower universities.
So Ramon, I mean, I think that's really helpful in terms of what your working style has been and the sorts of quality assurance conversations that you've facilitated, which we will talk about in Africa, such as HAQUA. But James, I mean, perhaps come back, put the question back to you. It doesn't sound to me as if within the world medical accreditation culture, there is that willingness to create bottom-up conversations. I mean, has that been your experience? Is it a regulator that seeks to exclude rather than encourage dialogue?
I would agree that it seeks to exclude, and there's a regionality around it, despite its name of World Federation, because it's very much guided by links with the American system of accreditation. And I think that creates some problems in itself. But stepping back, I think what you said, Professor Torrent, around how to conceptualize it in terms of what the EU cannot achieve is a very interesting way that I think we can look at it as well. So thanks very much.
You know, James, if you allow me, first, please don't address me as Professor Ramon or Professor Torrent, because I'm sufficiently old. And if you begin to address me as professor, I will collapse here, and it will be very painful for you looking this. But I want to say something on this. What you have just said, James, and I promise I will not quote you in another context, but you have just said, allows us, now that we are arriving to the end of the hour, and I think it's better to be punctual in these webinars, allows us for a nice return to the origin of our webinar. What happens with these institutions that are, in good old-fashioned Latin, totum revolutum, at world and global level? That when you enter totum revolutum, revolutum totum, but the ones who really are leading and governing are not all, but a few. This is something that I understand. I would criticize it politically, but I understand the logic of this. As I say, better to have people collaborating in the area of medicine than throwing bombs the one to the other, whoever is the one who leads this. But this is an issue. It's a problem. And it's precisely the justification for the interregional. If you had the interregional federation, probably this federation in substance would continue to say more or less the same. However, the institutional framework would be different. And maybe there would be more possibilities in 10 or 15 years of the substance changing. I imagine that if I said in the federation that in poor countries, most of the work done by doctors in the best hospitals in the United States could be done by nurses, that would be a sort of an anathema and the worst heterodoxy. But maybe if it was interregional, little by little, people would begin to understand this. In any case, these are ideas that if you do not create an adequate framework, frankly, and in good jargon English, who the hell is able to launch these ideas? We can do this because this is a webinar of your center, and David is so nice, so kind, and so open. But this doesn't happen at the international sphere. So we need to create frameworks that rather are favorable to new ideas and to new ideas that maybe challenge the power structure that is traditional.
So there you go, James. The answer probably is to set up your own federation as well as conform with the global regulator. I mean, Ramon, you've been very entertaining and honest and frank. You've drawn on your enormous experience and offered us a vision, which I think very much is ongoing in terms of some of the interregional dialogues around quality assurance in Africa, which are absolutely, as you put it, about trying to make sense and understand what we're all trying to do, trying to make sense of what universities are for in terms of good pedagogy and good dialogues. So again, thank you, Ramon, very, very much for an entertaining hour. James, thank you very much for a thoughtful question. We are going to return to some of these themes in the next 2 weeks, because next week we are going to be talking to the president of the African Association of Universities, who will be talking about the African University and drawing on his experience of working in dialogue and within association. And then the final week, we are going to be talking to Howard Davis and Elizabeth Colucci, who will be talking about UN recognition conventions, HACWA, which is a partnership that OBREAL has facilitated between the European Union and the African Union to look at quality assurance. And I think these are conversations that are sometimes seen as unglamorous, but also very important. And Ramon, you've given us a great vision for continuing these conversations and for the value of interregional dialogue. So Ramon, thank you again for making the time. We'll look forward to seeing you and as many people as possible next week. And for now, I shall stop and say thank you all for coming and see you again.